Something inside a lifeless British forest just made scientists question everything. 4 bison were released into a dead forest, and what happened next left them horrified. In April 2024, Ranger Fiona Marsh stood at the edge of a fenced clearing in the Southwood Estate in the Scottish borders, watching 4 European bison step out of their transport crates into a forest so dense and lightless that her team had nicknamed it the Tunnel. Within the first hour, one bull rammed his shoulder into a dying spruce, and the entire tree came down in a single crack that echoed across the valley. Marsh admitted afterward that her first instinct was not excitement. It was fear that they had just released something the forest could not handle. The information in this video was cross-checked using data from NatureScot, the Southwood Rewilding Trust, the European Bison Conservation Center, and field logs shared by rangers working directly on the reintroduction. The Southwood Estate covers around 1,400 hectares of the Scottish borders, a stretch of land that had been converted almost entirely into commercial Sitka spruce plantation across the mid-20th century. By the 2000s, ecological surveys described the interior of the forest as close to a green desert, with dense, uniform rows of identical trees planted so tightly that almost no sunlight reached the ground. Bird surveys conducted in 2018 recorded fewer than a third of the species expected in a healthy native woodland of similar size, and soil sampling found almost no invertebrate activity beneath the thickest stands. The estate had already tried the conventional fix: selective felling, thinning crews, and manual clearing of undergrowth. It worked, briefly, wherever the machines went. But the plantation covered too much ground, and within a few growing seasons, the canopy always closed back over. That's the problem 4 bison were brought in to solve, not to be conserved themselves, but to be used as a tool, much like similar projects already running in Kent. European bison, once extinct in the wild entirely by 1927 and rebuilt from just 12 captive founder animals, have since been reintroduced across Poland, Romania, Germany, and the Netherlands, with the global wild population now estimated at around 7,000. But no bison had ever been released specifically into a commercial conifer plantation before. Every previous UK and European project had focused on broadleaf or mixed woodland. Southwood was, in that sense, an experiment nobody had run. The 4 selected animals, 1 bull and 3 cows, sourced from a conservation herd in Germany, were chosen for genetic diversity and screened for disease before a 6-week quarantine period. Once released into a 40-hectare trial enclosure, rangers expected the bison to behave the same way they had in Kent's ancient broadleaf woodland. They didn't. Within the first 3 months, the bison targeted the Sitka spruce far more aggressively than expected. Sitka bark, it turned out, was thin and easy to strip compared to the thicker bark of native oak and beech the animals had encountered in previous reintroductions, and the bison seemed to prefer rubbing against the smaller, weaker trees rather than the older growth. By August 2024, rangers had counted more than 340 stripped or felled spruce within the enclosure, far higher than the equivalent period in any broadleaf release site on record. Some members of the estate's advisory board reportedly raised concerns that the bison were simply destroying a working forest rather than restoring one, and for several tense weeks the future of the trial was genuinely uncertain. To settle the argument, the Southwood Rewilding Trust brought in an independent monitoring team rather than relying on its own staff's observations. Between June and October 2024, that team walked the same 40-hectare enclosure every 2 weeks, tagging every fallen or heavily stripped tree with a numbered marker so its condition could be tracked over time rather than judged from a single visit. Of the 340 affected spruce, roughly 60% were already showing signs of disease or root rot before the bison ever touched them. meaning the animals were, largely without knowing it, clearing out the weakest trees first rather than felling the plantation indiscriminately. That distinction mattered enormously to the advisory board, since it reframed the damage from random destruction into something closer to natural thinning. Then the monitoring data started coming back in full. Light meters placed across the enclosure floor recorded a rise in average ground-level sunlight, from under 2% of open sky levels to over 26% in the areas where bison had been most active. Botanist Callum Reed, brought in to survey the cleared patches, found something rangers hadn't anticipated. Dormant seed banks of native bilberry and heather, some likely undisturbed in the soil for over 40 years, had begun germinating in the newly opened ground. Insect traps set up in September recorded triple the number of beetle species compared to an untouched plantation nearby, most of them species associated specifically with decaying conifer deadwood. The knock-on effects did not stop with insects. By the following spring, acoustic monitoring devices installed by a local birdwatching group picked up something rangers had not heard in that section of forest in over a decade: the drumming call of a great spotted woodpecker, a species that depends on standing dead wood for nesting cavities and had previously been recorded only on the estate's older broadleaf margins. Pine marten scat, identified through DNA swabbing by a university research team, turned up in the cleared zones for the first time that same spring, suggesting the newly opened understory was already drawing in mammals that had avoided the dense plantation entirely. None of this means the project is a guaranteed success. A 2025 review commissioned by NatureScott was explicit that it remains too early to say whether bison-driven disturbance in a conifer plantation will produce the same long-term biodiversity gains seen in broadleaf sites, since spruce decomposes differently and supports a narrower range of decay-dependent species than oak or beech. There's also an unresolved concern about commercial timber value, and Southwood's estate managers had to formally write off a portion of plantation stock earlier than planned, a cost the Rewilding Trust is still negotiating how to offset. Early estimates put that write-off at somewhere between £40,000 and £60,000 in lost timber revenue, a figure the trust is trying to recover partly through carbon credit schemes tied to the forest's improving soil carbon storage, though those calculations are still being audited. A similar experiment is now being watched closely in Bavaria, where a small bison herd was introduced into a former spruce monoculture damaged by bark beetle outbreaks. German foresters there reported comparable early results: aggressive bark stripping of weakened conifers, followed by a measurable rise in ground vegetation within the first 2 growing seasons. Interestingly, the Bavarian team documented an almost identical pattern to Southwood's. Bison consistently targeted trees already weakened by beetle damage over healthy neighboring spruce, which German researchers now suspect may be linked to subtle differences in bark chemistry or moisture content that the animals can somehow detect. Different country, different forestry crisis, but the same underlying pattern. An animal built for open woodland disturbance doesn't distinguish between an ancient oak and a commercial spruce. And in landscapes drowning in monoculture, that indifference may be exactly what's needed. What happened at Southwood isn't a story about bison saving a forest overnight. It's a story about how little anyone actually knew about what these animals would do outside the type of woodland they'd already been tested in, and how a project that looked, for a few tense months, like it might be failing, turned out to be doing exactly the kind of disruptive, unglamorous work that a plantation forest desperately needed. The lesson rangers keep repeating is uncomfortable but familiar by now. Recovery rarely looks tidy while it's happening. So what do you think? Should more commercial plantations across Britain be opened up to large herbivores like bison, even at the cost of existing timber value? Or is this too risky a trade-off for working forests? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe to follow the next chapter in this ongoing experiment to bring Britain's dead forests back to life.